The couple was tearing up old floorboards in their farmhouse when they found a hidden trapdoor that shouldn't have been there. What they discovered beneath it was so disturbing that strangers would soon be watching their every move. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The morning air carried the sharp bite of autumn as Elena Vasquez stood on the wraparound porch of the old Merrick farmhouse, hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. The sun was just beginning to crest over the ridge of pine trees that bordered their property, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Mist clung to the valleys below, thick and white, making the farmhouse feel like an island floating above the clouds. It was the kind of morning that had convinced her and her husband David to buy this place. The kind of beauty that made you forget about cracked foundations and rotting windowsills. They had found the property 6 months ago while driving through rural New Hampshire, taking back roads through the White Mountains on what was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. The realtor's sign had been barely visible, half hidden by overgrown lilacs at the end of a rutted dirt road. Elena, who worked as a restoration architect for historic buildings in Boston, had insisted they stop. David, a structural engineer with a weakness for old houses, had agreed before she'd even finished asking. The Merrick farmhouse had been built in 1891 by a lumber baron named Thaddeus Merrick, who'd made his fortune clear-cutting the surrounding forests. The house was a testament to that wealth. 3 stories of hand-hewn timber, with intricate woodwork and a stone foundation that had withstood more than a century of harsh New England winters. But it had been abandoned for nearly 15 years, and time had not been kind. The previous owner, an elderly woman named Agnes Colby, had died without heirs, and the property had languished in probate until the county finally put it up for auction. Elena and David had won the bid for less than the cost of a 1-bedroom condo in Boston. Their friends thought they were insane. Their families worried they were making a terrible mistake. But Elena had walked through those rooms and seen past the water damage and the peeling wallpaper. She'd seen the original heart pine floors, the hand-carved mantels, the wavy glass in the windows that proved their age. David had inspected the bones, the massive beams, the solid stone foundation, and declared it sound. They'd signed the papers, quit their jobs, and moved in 3 months later with nothing but their savings, their tools, and a stubborn determination to bring the house back to life. Now, for months into the renovation, they were living in controlled chaos. The second floor was still uninhabitable, sheets of plastic hanging where walls needed to be rebuilt. They'd set up a makeshift bedroom in what had once been the parlor, sleeping on a mattress surrounded by construction equipment. The kitchen was functional, barely, with a hot plate and a mini-fridge standing in for the appliances they'd eventually install. Every surface was covered in dust, every room smelled of sawdust and paint thinner, and Elena had never been happier. David emerged from the house, his tall frame filling the doorway. He was already dressed for work, faded jeans, a thermal shirt, work boots caked with dried mud. His dark hair stuck up at odd angles, and there was a smudge of something, grease, maybe, or spackle, on his cheek. He'd been a clean-cut corporate engineer 6 months ago, always in pressed shirts and polished shoes. Elena loved this version of him more. "Ready to tackle the main room?" he asked, accepting the second mug of coffee she'd poured for him. Elena nodded, setting down her cup. "Let's do this. I want those floors exposed by tonight." The main room, what they'd taken to calling the Great Room, was the heart of the house. It occupied the entire front section of the first floor, with high ceilings supported by exposed beams and tall windows that overlooked the valley. Original built-in bookcases flanked a massive stone fireplace, and despite the decades of neglect, Elena could still see the room's former grandeur. But first, they had to deal with the floors. At some point in the 1970s, someone had made the baffling decision to cover the original hardwood with cheap vinyl tiles. The tiles had been installed directly over the wood, glued down with industrial adhesive that had turned brittle and yellow with age. Elena had spent weeks carefully removing them, section by section, trying not to damage the wood beneath. It was tedious work, requiring patience and precision, qualities David sometimes lacked, but Elena had in abundance. They worked in companionable silence, the kind that comes from years together and shared purpose. Elena and David had met in graduate school, both studying at MIT. She in architecture, he in civil engineering. They'd been married for 8 years now, and this house had become their joint obsession, their shared project, the thing that had reignited a spark that had begun to dim under the weight of corporate careers and city living. By mid-morning, they'd cleared another section of vinyl, revealing beautiful oak planks beneath. Elena sat back on her heels, admiring the wood grain that swirled like water. "Look at this," she said softly. "This is probably 200-year-old growth. You can't find wood like this anymore." David grunted in agreement, focused on prying up a particularly stubborn tile near the center of the room. He worked the crowbar beneath it, applying steady pressure. The tile cracked and came free, and he tossed it into the growing pile near the door. But when he looked down at what he'd exposed, he froze. "Elena." Something in his voice made her look up immediately. David was staring at the floor, crowbar hanging loose in his hand. "What is it? Come here." Elena crossed the room and knelt beside him. At first, she didn't see it, just more oak planks, darkened with age. But then her trained eye caught the inconsistency. The grain pattern was wrong. The boards in this section ran perpendicular to the rest of the floor, forming a rough rectangle about 4 feet by 5 feet. And there, nearly invisible in the shadow of a remaining tile, was a small iron ring recessed into the wood. Elena's heart began to beat faster. She'd restored dozens of historic buildings, seen countless architectural quirks and hidden features. But something about this felt different. The placement was too deliberate, the craftsmanship too careful. "Is that what I think it is?" David asked. Elena reached out, tracing the seam with her fingers. The boards were fitted together with precision, the gaps between them barely visible. This wasn't shoddy work hidden under vinyl. This was skilled carpentry, meant to be concealed. "It's a trapdoor," she said quietly. They looked at each other. David's expression mirrored her own, equal parts excitement and unease. In all their research on the house, in all the property records and historical documents they'd combed through, there had been no mention of a cellar or basement under this section. The house had a root cellar accessed from the kitchen and a small crawlspace foundation, but nothing here. Nothing in the main room. "We should open it," Elena said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Agreed," David replied, but he didn't move. They stayed like that for a moment, both staring at the hidden door. Elena tried to rationalize the flutter of anxiety in her chest. It was probably nothing, old storage space, maybe, or access to some long-forgotten utility. People in the 19th century often built unusual features into their homes. This was likely just another quirk of an old house. But the way it had been hidden, covered so deliberately. David stood and retrieved a pry bar from their tool collection. "Let's see what Mr. Merrick was hiding." Together, they worked to expose the entire outline of the door, pulling up the remaining tiles around its perimeter. The rectangle was about 4 feet by 5 feet, large enough for a person to pass through comfortably. The iron ring was set flush with the surface, oxidized but still solid. David gripped the ring and pulled. Nothing happened. The door was sealed tight, whether by age, swelling wood, or something more deliberate, they couldn't tell. He positioned the pry bar in the seam and leaned his weight into it. Wood groaned. Dust puffed up from the cracks. Elena held her breath. With a sharp crack that echoed through the empty house, the seal broke. The door shifted upward an inch. David adjusted his grip and pulled again, and this time the entire door lifted free, hinges screaming in protest. They pulled it all the way open and propped it against the wall. A rush of air came up from below, cold and damp, carrying a smell that made Elena step back instinctively. It wasn't the smell of rot or mold, though there was dampness. It was something else, something that smelled like earth and stone and time itself. Below was darkness, complete and impenetrable. David pulled his phone from his pocket and activated the flashlight. The bright LED beam cut down into the opening, revealing the top rungs of a wooden ladder descending into shadow. The ladder looked old but sturdy, made from the same heavy timber as the house itself. "How deep is it?" Elena whispered, though she didn't know why she was whispering. David angled the light downward, trying to see the bottom. "At least 12 feet. Maybe more." Elena knelt at the edge, peering down. The flashlight beam illuminated rough stone walls, not the poured concrete of a modern foundation, but carefully fitted stones like those in the main house's exterior. This wasn't a hastily dug hole. This was a deliberate construction, built to last. "There's a floor at the bottom," David said, his voice tight. "Stone or packed earth, I can't tell. And I think there's furniture down there." "Furniture? Or boxes. Something. They looked at each other. The excitement Elena had felt was gone now, replaced by something colder. Every instinct she'd developed over years of working with old buildings was firing warning signals. This wasn't right. The concealment, the depth, the careful construction. This wasn't a simple storage space. But they couldn't not look. The house was theirs now. Whatever secrets it held belonged to them. "I'll go first," David said. "Like hell you will," Elena replied. "We go together, or we don't go at all." David smiled despite his obvious nervousness. It was one of the things he loved about her. Elena Vasquez didn't let anyone, not even her husband, make decisions for her. Together, then. He went first anyway, testing each rung carefully before committing his full weight. The ladder held, though it creaked ominously with each step. Elena watched from above, her phone's flashlight adding to the illumination. When David's feet touched the bottom, he called up, "It's solid. Come on down." Elena descended carefully, her hands gripping the worn rungs. When she reached the bottom and stood beside David, they both swept their lights around the space, and Elena's breath caught in her throat. It was a room. A real, deliberately constructed room, carved into the earth beneath their farmhouse. The walls were lined with fitted stone, the floor was packed earth, and the ceiling was the underside of their floorboards, supported by heavy beams. The space was roughly 12 feet square, with a ceiling high enough for David to stand upright. But it was what filled the room that made Elena's mouth go dry. Boxes. Dozens of them. Wooden crates stacked along the walls, metal footlockers, even several modern plastic storage containers that looked wildly out of place among the older items. And there, against the far wall, stood a tall metal filing cabinet, its surface dulled by time and moisture. David moved toward the nearest crate, and Elena followed. He brushed away a thick layer of dust, revealing stenciled numbers on the side. August 23rd, 1967. "A date," Elena murmured. They moved to another box. This one read, November 14th, 1973. Another, March 7th, 1981. They went through the room systematically, checking crate after crate. The dates ranged from the mid-1960s to as recent as 1998. Some boxes had initials stenciled beside the dates. Others bore symbols, geometric patterns, strings of numbers, codes Elena didn't recognize. "What is all this?" David said, more to himself than to Elena. Elena's architect's mind was racing, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. This room had been used for storage, obviously, but the deliberate organization, the labeling, the sheer span of years represented. This wasn't someone's old belongings stashed away and forgotten. This was systematic. This was purposeful. David had moved to the filing cabinet. He tried the top drawer. Locked. He tried the others. All locked. "Stand back," he said, and before Elena could protest, he'd raised a nearby crowbar and brought it down on the lock of the top drawer. The metal shrieked and gave way. David pulled the drawer open. Inside were files. Dozens of manila folders, each one labeled with a name and a date. David pulled one out at random, and Elena crowded close to look. The name on the tab read, Margaret Holloway, 1979. David opened it. Inside were photographs. Black and white prints, some slightly faded, showing a woman in her 30s. She was photographed from a distance in various locations, walking down a street, getting into a car, standing in what looked like a grocery store parking lot. In each photo, she was unaware of the camera. In each photo, she was being watched. Clipped to the photos were handwritten notes. Times, locations, descriptions of clothing, license plate numbers. Someone had documented this woman's movements in meticulous detail. Elena's hands were shaking as she reached for another file. This one was labeled, Robert Chun, 1983. More photos. More notes. Another person's life reduced to surveillance records. Jesus Christ, David breathed. Someone was stalking these people. They opened more files. Each one the same. Each one a complete dossier on an individual. Some files were thin, just a few photos and notes. Others were inches thick, representing years of observation. Names, addresses, employers, family members, daily routines, all documented with chilling precision. Elena felt sick. They were standing in someone's secret room, surrounded by evidence of what could only be described as systematic stalking. But who? And why? David had moved to another drawer, forcing it open. This one contained maps. He spread one out on top of the cabinet, a detailed topographical map of New Hampshire and the surrounding states. Elena's flashlight beam caught something that made her stomach drop. Red pins. Dozens of them, scattered across the map like drops of blood. Each pin marked a specific location. And beside each pin, written in tiny, precise handwriting, was a name and a date. David's finger traced across the map, his voice barely audible. These names, they matched the files. Elena pulled out her phone, checked for signal. Nothing. They were too far from the nearest cell tower, too deep underground. She looked at David, saw her own fear reflected in his face. "We need to get out of here," she said. "We need to call the police." David nodded, already moving toward the ladder. But as Elena turned to follow, her flashlight beam caught something else. A box she hadn't noticed before, sitting apart from the others. It was smaller, wooden, with brass hinges. And unlike the other boxes, this one was unlocked. Her hand moved toward it almost without her willing it. David was calling to her from the ladder, telling her to hurry, but she couldn't stop herself. She lifted the lid. Inside was a leather journal. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age. Elena opened it to a random page and saw neat handwriting filling the lines. She read the first sentence and felt ice flood her veins. "They don't know I'm watching. They never do. That's the beauty of it." She slammed the journal shut, suddenly desperate to be out of this room, away from these files and photos and the sick mind that had created this archive. She shoved the journal into her jacket pocket. Evidence, she thought. They'd need evidence, and practically ran for the ladder. David was already halfway up, and Elena scrambled after him. They burst back into the main room, gasping as if they'd been underwater, gulping down air that didn't smell like earth and secrets. David pulled Elena away from the opening, his hands on her shoulders. "Are you okay?" She nodded, though she wasn't. Her mind was reeling. "We have to call the police. Right now." But before David could respond, before either of them could move toward the door, they heard it. From somewhere above them, from the second floor they thought was empty, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving across the floorboards directly overhead. Someone else was in the house. Elena and David froze, eyes locked, both holding their breath. The footsteps continued, moving from one room to another, unhurried and methodical, as if whoever was up there was searching for something, or listening for them. The footsteps overhead stopped. Elena and David stood frozen in the great room, the open trapdoor yawning behind them like a mouth. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound of movement. It was the silence of someone listening, waiting, calculating their next move. David's hand found Elena's and squeezed tight. His palm was slick with sweat. Without speaking, he gestured toward the front door, their only exit from the room. But to reach it, they'd have to cross 20 feet of open space, their footsteps audible on the bare wood floors they'd just exposed. Elena shook her head and pointed instead toward the kitchen. There was a back door there, and from the kitchen they could reach the mudroom and slip outside. It was a longer route, but it offered more cover, more options. David nodded. Moving as quietly as they could, they crept toward the kitchen doorway. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a gunshot in the heavy silence. Elena's heart hammered so hard she was certain whoever was upstairs could hear it. They'd just reached the kitchen threshold when the footsteps resumed, faster now, purposeful, heading toward the main staircase. Someone was coming down. "Go," David hissed, and they abandoned stealth for speed. They burst through the kitchen, past their makeshift cooking setup, and into the mudroom. David grabbed the doorknob, twisted, and it didn't turn. Locked. In their months of living here, they'd never locked this door. Never had a reason to. "The window," Elena said, already moving toward the small casement window above the utility sink. David boosted her up, and she fumbled with the latch, her fingers clumsy with panic. Behind them, they could hear footsteps in the great room now, slow and measured, as if their visitor had all the time in the world. The window latch gave way. Elena shoved it open and squeezed through, dropping into the dead garden below. David followed, his larger frame barely fitting through the narrow opening. They hit the ground running, not looking back, their feet pounding across the overgrown lawn toward the tree line. They'd parked David's truck near the barn, about 100 yards from the house. If they could reach it, if the keys were still in the ignition where David habitually left them, they could escape, get to town, get help. They were halfway across the yard when Elena risked a glance back at the house. A figure stood in the window of the great room, watching them. Tall, wearing dark clothing, face obscured by the reflection of morning light on glass. Not moving, just watching. David, Elena gasped, and he looked back too, his face going white. They ran harder. The barn loomed ahead, its weathered red paint peeling, one door hanging crooked on its hinges. David's truck sat where they'd left it that morning, covered in a fine layer of dust and fallen leaves. David reached it first, yanked open the driver's door, and reached for the ignition. His hand froze. The keys were gone. No, 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 he muttered, patting his pockets frantically. I left them here. I always leave them here. Elena looked back at the house. The figure was no longer in the window. Check the console, the seats, anywhere. They're not here, Elena. Someone took them. The words hit her like ice water. Someone had been in their truck. Someone had been preparing for this moment, ensuring they couldn't leave. We have to hide, David said, his voice tight with controlled panic. The barn. We can hide in the barn and figure out what to do. They slipped through the crooked door into the barn's dim interior. The space was vast and mostly empty, stripped of whatever equipment it had once housed. Old hay bales were stacked in one corner, rusty farm implements hung on the walls, and a wooden ladder led up to a hayloft above. Shafts of sunlight streamed through gaps in the walls, creating columns of dusty light. David pulled Elena behind a stack of hay bales, and they crouched there, trying to quiet their breathing, trying to think. Who was that? Elena whispered. How did they get in? I don't know, David replied. But they wanted us to find that room. The trapdoor was covered, but not well hidden. The files were right there, easy to find. It's like bait, Elena finished. The journal in her pocket felt suddenly heavy. She pulled it out, opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat, almost mechanical in its precision. The first entry was dated April 3rd, 1965. I've realized that watching is an art form. Most people go through life blind to the patterns around them, but I see everything. Today I followed Subject A to the grocery store. She bought milk, bread, and a magazine, Better Homes and Gardens. She doesn't know I exist. The power in that is intoxicating. The footsteps overhead stopped. Elena and David stood frozen, the open trapdoor behind them. Without speaking, David gestured toward the kitchen. They crept through the house, reached the back door, locked. Someone had locked them in. The window, Elena whispered. They squeezed through the mudroom window and ran across the overgrown lawn toward David's truck near the barn. David reached for the ignition. The keys were gone. Someone took them, he said, his voice tight with panic. We have to hide. They slipped into the barn's dim interior and crouched behind hay bales. Elena pulled out the journal she'd grabbed from the hidden room, flipping through pages of obsessive entries spanning decades. The final entry was dated 3 weeks ago. Asterisk, new people have moved into the house. They'll find a room eventually. I made sure of that. They need to understand what this place is. The house remembers. And so do I. Asterisk. Below were detailed observations of Elena and David's every move for 4 months. They'd been watched from the moment they arrived. Footsteps crunched on gravel outside. A woman entered, tall, thin, probably in her 70s, with gray hair pulled back severely. She moved with unsettling precision. I know you're here. I know you found my collection, she said calmly. I built that room in 1964. When I discovered my gift for watching without being seen, I knew I needed a place to preserve my work. David and Elena pressed flat in the hayloft above, barely breathing. You faked your death, David called out. The woman smiled. Yes, Agnes Colby is dead, but I needed to watch what would happen to my collection. And then you two arrived. Perfect subjects. You've been mine for 4 months, and you never knew. She pulled out David's phone. I've been reading your messages. I know about your money troubles. The baby you're hoping for. Everything. We're not leaving, Elena said, feeling the journal solid in her pocket. And we're not staying silent. The woman's expression darkened. She reached for a gasoline can on the wall, unscrewed the cap, and began pouring it across the barn floor. Then you've made a very poor choice. She dropped a lighter onto the gasoline trail. Fire erupted instantly, smoke filling the hayloft. Elena and David scrambled down the ladder, lungs burning. The woman blocked the door, a curved blade glinting in her hand. David grabbed a pitchfork and swung it toward her, creating just enough space for Elena to bolt through. They ran from the burning barn, gasping clean air. Then they saw them, police cars coming up the road, their lights flashing. The woman saw them too and ran into the forest, disappearing into the pines. Later, Elena learned the neighbor had called 911 about the smoke. The woman was actually Margaret Thorne, wanted in connection with 3 missing persons cases dating back to the 1980s. She was captured 3 days later in an abandoned hunting cabin. The farmhouse became a crime scene. The hidden room was excavated, files matched to victims across 5 states. Their renovation was delayed, complicated. But 3 months later, after the investigation concluded, Elena and David returned. They filled the room with concrete, installed security cameras, and got a dog named Scout. The farmhouse slowly became what they'd envisioned, a home. The victims in those files thanked them for not looking away, for not staying silent. As winter came, Elena stood on the porch with morning coffee, watching the sunrise. David worked inside. Scout barked at squirrels. Everything was ordinary. Everything was safe. And the trapdoor was buried forever beneath the life they were building together. Don't stop here. The next story will shock you even more. Hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on the bell so you never miss what's coming, and share this video with a friend. Let's see how many people we can leave speechless tonight. ***.